Hi, everyone. Welcome to the lecture for Chapter 1, today we're going to talk about the environment, sustainability, and less so science in general. So the learning objectives for this chapter are, first we're going to talk about sustainability in general. If you happen to be in my online class last semester, which was all about sustainability, some of this might be a little bit of review. We're going to talk a little bit about ecosystems, what those are and why they are important. And finally, I'm going to briefly talk about sustainable development. So these three sections were covered in pretty strong detail in your chapter, in addition to kind of what is science. I'm not going to lecture about the scientific method and what science is and why it's important, but I do expect you to read it. It'll come up again later in the semester. I'm also going to spend a little less time on sustainable development because you're going to watch a TED Talk after this about sustainable development goals. So first of all, what do we mean by the term sustainability? We hear sustainability all over the place. It's quite a popular uh, word these days to describe things, but it basically means meeting the needs of the present in an equitable and fair fashion without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, right? We don't want to use so many more resources today that there are no resources left for the future, but we also want to be equitable and fair in how we are meeting our needs today. We are often kind of failing to do this. And we spent a whole class last semester in Geography 170, if you took it, discussing sustainability at length. Um, but sustainability is all about maintaining the ability to accommodate three important sources of change, right? So there are three ways in which change is happening. First, the world is changing. Environments are under constant change. We are changing, right? Technology changes our needs for ecosystem services. And I'm going to talk more about what ecosystem services are in a minute, but they're basically the things that the environment does for us. And we are changing the world, right? The most immediate way to think about this is climate change, right? We're going to spend a lot more time later in the semester talking about climate change, but humans are impacting and altering the environment. The environment itself is also constantly changing, right? Environmental change and ecosystem change we're gonna learn is a constant anyways. We are now changing things at a much more rapid rate than was happening in the past. We are having massive effects. We are having and have had massive effects on ecosystems. And also the way that we live is changing, right? The way that we live today, the way that you are taking this class and I am lecturing to you is a lot different. I would have not had an option to take a class like this 25 years ago. The technology really wasn't there in order to do it. Sustainability is also all about the triple bottom line, which is also known as the three Ps: planet, people, and profit. And so basically, while we're trying to meet the needs of today, while securing resources for the needs of people who are going to come after us, we also want to make sure that we are treating the planet well. And we measure that by pollution output, waste production, energy use, species conservation, say habitat destruction, etc. People, we want people to be taken care of, things like human health and well-being, equity, equal access to things, social resources, and benefits to a community. And then also profit, right? We live in a capitalist economic system. So we cannot be just concerned about people and the planet. Maybe in an ideal situation we could, but things also have to be profitable to keep the economy going. So that is the big kind of takeaway of sustainability, or the current really strong model for sustainability, is this threefold approach. While we are doing things, we need to be concerned about people, we need to be concerned about the planet, and we need to be concerned about the economics. And we combine all of those things, we get a sustainable system. Generally speaking, profits and economics kind of get a bigger focus these days, often due to kind of the way capitalism works. So we can think about other ways, and we'll learn other ways why we can take care of profit, but we can also help people and the planet at the same time. Right, and it takes a community often to do this. So your book in the very beginning talked about unsustainable versus sustainable fishing, right? So it talked about the Newfoundland cod fishery that was having was kind of a very steady backbone economic fishing industry. And then you could see all of a sudden people started taking more and more. This has to do with technology, right? As we become better fishers, markets for fish, there's more money to be made off fish. And then that community of fish collapses. And that's what happens with fisheries. I spent a lot of time studying fisheries. And basically, you need a certain amount of fish in the ocean to keep reproducing and replenishing that fish population. And if you go below that, you will have a complete collapse of a fish stock. And so this is something called tragedy of the commons, right? And tragedy of the commons is basically this theory that says if everybody is using this resource, right, that's publicly kind of available to everybody, everybody is going to go after their own self-interest. And because by exploiting more and more of this resource, they can make more money, they really do not have an incentive. And so these kind of common pool resources can lead to situations like the Newfoundland cod industry, where it will completely collapse. So this tragedy of the commons kind of focuses on self-interest, right? That people are kind of inherently selfish, and if they can keep making more money, they will. So is the Earth doomed to the tragedy of the commons? Many environmental scientists say no. This is Elinor Ostrom, who wrote a lot about tragedy of the commons, and says there are lots of great examples, including in fisheries, where people can get together and manage things as a community. But what we're going to see in a lot of the things that come up over the course of the semester and kind of these management of natural resources is that you really need people, right? You really need a community and people to come together and manage these resources together. There we go. And the other thing is ecosystems can renew most resources, not all. Your chapter talks about non-renewable, renewable resources. I'm not going to talk about it in lecture so much. I will later in the semester when we talk about renewable and non-renewable resources. But, you know, all resources are technically renewable. Fossil fuels are technically renewable, but they're on such a large time scale that it doesn't really help us. If it takes millions of years to make oil, that's not going to get us any new oil in our lifespan. But things like water, if used wisely, replenishes itself through the system. Things like forests, but again, they have to be used wisely. So the tragedy of the commons, which people often talk about, is a bit of an oversimplification. There are lots of ways in which communities can come together and governments can come together. And Elinor Ostrom talks about the things that need to go into that, and your book talks about it, things like community and governance and cooperation and trust. In order to make these things happen. And fisheries is a great example of where that has happened in some cases. It certainly has not happened in many cases, though. But there are numerous cases of sustainably managed resources. We just have to learn to use those as a model to manage other resources, which sometimes we're not that good at doing. And numerous examples of community success, right? Especially smaller communities, again, managing things like fisheries and forests. So we've also had more pressure on our resources. Our population has expanded really rapidly, right? So, for the thousands of years that the human species has been around, a lot more than that, our numbers were fairly low. Even, up until about the Industrial Revolution, right, we had under a billion people, well under a billion people on the planet. Now we're over 7 billion people, right? And so some people think that this might cap around 9 billion people. We will wait and see if that happens. But, population has risen exponentially in the past several hundred years due to the Industrial Revolution and due to kind of this access of resources, which includes, things like the ability to grow a lot more food, which again, we'll talk about also a little bit later in the semester. But as our population has grown up, gone up. In addition, so has our resource use per person. And certainly, we are going to learn as the semester goes on, some countries are using a lot more resources than other countries. The United States is a very heavy resource user. Your ecological footprint, or the amount of resources that you are using to kind of sustain your life, is a lot higher than somebody in a developing country, generally speaking, right? We use more electricity, we waste more food, we drive our cars more, we have bigger homes, we have electronics and computers and a bunch of other things that kind of keep our lives going. So as these, when we're thinking about sustainability, we also want to think about the fact that there's a lot more people on this planet using these resources. Um, and so policies have addressed conflicts about this resource use. Things like commercial interests in clean water and conservation of species is often in conflict. Especially right now, we hear about this a lot in the news. Our current administration has really weakened the Environmental Protection Agency, which is different than the Obama administration. During the 80s, the Reagan administration also severely weakened the EPA. These things tend to kind of go back. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which we'll learn a lot more about in coming chapters, right? Their ability to kind of regulate clean air and clean water. But we generally make policy in order to do this, right? We have this goal of maintaining human well-being. This is why we are regulating this. We used to have a lot worse environmental problems in the United States, massive amounts of air pollution, rivers that were so polluted that they would literally catch fire. But generally speaking, we want to make sure that human beings have their basic needs met, such as food and shelter. We want to have good health, right? We don't want to walk outside and have such bad air pollution or be drinking unhealthy water. Certainly, this happens in plenty of cases. We want to have social sustainability. We don't want to have conflicts surrounding these resources. And we also want to have a certain amount of personal freedom in order to live and do what we want to do, especially in the United States. So just to not back up, but the environment, right? What do I mean when I'm talking about the environment in the first place? We're going to talk about the environment and preserving the environment a lot this semester. The environment is physical, chemical, and biological factors that kind of make up everything that surrounds us. Environmental science studies all aspects of that environment, right? So we are in a geography class, but we are studying a lot of environmental science, right? The book that you're doing is The Environment and You. So we're going to talk a lot about science and how it informs policy decisions. Ecology, which we're also going to talk a lot with, some people get confused about, is one of the disciplines of environmental science that studies the abundance and distribution of organisms. So the environment is everything, though, the physical, chemical, and biological factors. So the biotic and the abiotic. And this is just a little word bubble showing kind of all of the different things that kind of go into environmental science, human management, sustainability, pollution, population, chemistry. Environmental science is a very, very broad field. And when we look at ecosystems, because we're going to talk a lot about ecosystem management, ecosystems are all organisms and their physical and chemical environments. So what do I mean by that? I mean living organisms, plants, animal, bacteria, etc. And I mean abiotic, non-living elements of the environment, water, temperature, minerals, etc. And ecosystems are systems, right, that work together. So when you have a system, if you have a forest, for example, right, the forest, the trees are absorbing sunlight and water. Some of the animals are eating part of the vegetation. Other animals are eating other animals, right? You have to have certain kinds of minerals in the soil, a certain temperature to sustain that ecosystem, a certain amount of water. They are integrated systems, right? So that's basically what I'm trying to say. There's, generally speaking, if you affect one part of an ecosystem, it is highly likely that you're going to affect multiple parts of that ecosystem. For example, bacteria convert nitrogen in the soil so that plants may use it, right? If you grow any plants in your house and you put fertilizer on it, plants need nitrogen. Well, in nature, bacteria is converting that nitrogen so that the plants can use it, right? And then, conversely, the plants are doing a bunch of other things for the ecosystem. But ecosystems, energy and matter must flow in and out of a system. They are not a closed system. We have things like the water cycle and the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle and a bunch of other cycles. We will talk more about all of these cycles later in the semester. We're going to learn particularly about the water cycle and the carbon cycle. We're going to talk a lot about how those work. But they happen at multiple scales. And what I mean by ecosystems happening at multiple scales is you could talk about very small ecosystems, such as the ecosystem of your backyard, should you have a backyard. You could talk about the ecosystem of an entire region. You could talk about the ecosystem of the Sahara Desert, right? So they happen at multiple scales and they are not closed and they are all interacting with one another. So if we look at this example of an ecosystem here, we have some elephants at a watering hole. We have things that are flowing in to the ecosystem, sunlight and materials like carbon, nitrogen, and water. Then we have this transformation of energy and exchange of matter between biota and abiotic environments, right? The animals are drinking water, the plants are taking up water, there's nitrogen in the soil that's being taken up, and then an outflow of heat. It releases a certain amount of heat, and materials like carbon, nitrogen, and water as well. So you have inputs, transformations, outputs. Ecosystem services, which is an important concept for you to understand and know for this class, is they are services, things that the ecosystem provides to humans. And they come under, I'll talk about each one of these, but there are 4 types of ecosystem services. You're definitely going to have to know this for the quiz that you're going to take at the end of this module. But they are provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services. And so this little nice diagram here gives some examples of each, but I'm going to talk about what those are. So the first is provisioning services. That is supplying us with resources like food, water, fiber, air, things we are directly consuming. And we can modify the ecosystem to increase these services, right? We can change grasslands to cornfields, and then corn provides for humans, but now those fields support fewer species, right? So whatever was living in those grasslands before is no longer there, and now you have cornfields. But generally speaking, we have worked pretty hard in certain areas to increase provisioning ecosystem services in order to get these resources that we use. Then there is regulating services, and those control important conditions and services. So things like the climate, the flow of water, the absorption of pollutants, which trees do a lot of, and disease. So basically, the fact that we are able to exist on this rock floating through space, we have this nice climate that is not too hot, is not too cold, water rains down at us, and we're able to use that. So basically all of these regulating services, this is a big part of what we're concerned about with climate change, right? Because we're going to mess with the climate. It's also going to affect a bunch of other services, but we don't understand necessarily how it's going to affect the flows of water and the absorption of pollutants and then subsequently disease. Cultural services are spiritual and recreational benefits, which a lot of people associate with the environment but don't necessarily think of as a service. But these are things like hiking and other recreational activities, ecotourism, and also holy sites. For many cultures, including many Native Americans, right, many sites are sacred or holy, such as a church or a mosque or a temple would be. But we, generally speaking, get a lot of enjoyment, some of us maybe a little bit more than others, in the great outdoors, going for hikes, being outside. And then the last one is supporting services. And these are basic ecosystem processes like cycling nutrients, forming soil, pollination, which is a really big one. We still have a lot of crops that are naturally pollinated. California is might be the biggest almond grower in the world, definitely in the country. And all of those almonds are naturally pollinated by bees. And bees are disappearing due to something called colony collapse disorder, which we'll probably touch on later in the semester. But that is a supporting service that the ecosystem provides for us. When we think about ecosystem function functions through something called dynamic homeostasis. And basically, this means systems are constantly trying to adjust to reduce change from normal, right? So it is constantly changing, but it wants to get back to this kind of flux of normal. And there are two different types of feedbacks. So we can have negative feedback loops, and we can have positive feedback loops. Negative feedback loops are where a system reverses a directional change, which means I'll show an example of this in a second. But what I mean by a negative feedback, and I'll give you one that's very basic in the example of a pot of boiling water. But if I have a pot of water and I turn the heat on, that water will eventually start to boil. And by boiling, what that water is doing is releasing heat because that water cannot hold any more heat. So it is trying to get back to normal. So it is trying to get back to its original state. A positive feedback loop is where systems reinforce change. This is happening a lot with climate change. For example, and we'll talk about climate change and I'll talk about this positive feedback loop a lot more, but methane is a greenhouse gas, which means that methane, when released into the atmosphere, causes the climate to warm. And when the climate warms, more permafrost, or this frozen land that's found in traditionally frozen climates, thaws, decomposes all of this plant matter that's in there, and releases more methane. So now more methane, more warming, more melting. More methane, more warming, more melting. I want you guys to understand the positive and negative have nothing to do with whether or not it's an unwanted or a wanted change. Positive just means it's pushing something in one direction. Negative feedback means it's reversing the directional change back to what it was. And I'll show you an example here. So here's a negative feedback loop, right? So you have high algae populations deplete nutrients and algae growth begins to decline. And then as algae growth begins to decline, the nutrients begin to increase. And then as nutrients increase, algae growth increases. So it's this constant back and forth where you have a growth in algae, a reduction in algae, a growth in nutrients, a reduction in nutrients, right? It's this constant back and forth that's happening with this negative feedback loop. In a positive feedback loop, this is different, where you have, if you cut down forests, you initiate erosion. By initiating erosion, it gets accelerated and it causes more forest loss, right? So now the trees that are there are able to hold on less. So cutting down trees causes erosion, erosion causes more trees to die, causes more erosion. So it's going in one, it's pushing the change in one direction. But ecosystem change is inevitable, right? We have ecosystems that are changing all the time. So we'll talk more about wildfires later in the semester, but generally speaking, wildfires are also a natural occurrence. They're happening differently now because of a lot of the changes that we've made. But wildfire can come in, a natural wildfire can come in, and we manage for these a lot now. Clear the brush. All of a sudden, you can have new things growing up. That ecosystem is going to change, but eventually, usually, they kind of regulate back to where they were. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is sustainable development. And again, I'm not going to lecture on this too heavily. This was covered really heavily in your text, and you're going to watch a TED Talk about it after this. But in 2015, the United Nations made a resolution and set 17 sustainable development goals. So this is not the first time that they've set, they had kind of millennium goals. They've set various goals, but these are kind of the new 17. They've really expanded upon them, but they're kind of how do we want the world to develop? What do we want to see happen, and how do we achieve sustainability? And I'm going to go through each one of these. It's going to get very listy. Again, they're all listed in your textbook. I wouldn't kind of be concerned with writing them all down. These are going to sound like very lofty goals. The TED Talk that you're going to watch is going to talk about how we can make things like this happen. But I want you to understand these goals because they're really, a lot of times people think about environmental conservation and they think it is something that is going to occur in a vacuum outside of other things, and it is really not. But these actions focus on two primary themes. The first is protecting the planet, which obviously we talk a lot about in this class, but also investing in the future that we want. What do we want our future to look like? The goal is full implementation by 2030. That is certainly pretty ambitious when we think about these 17 goals. Goal number one, no poverty. And poverty in all of its forms everywhere. This has been a goal for a while for the UN. Poverty globally is decreasing or has decreased, while inequality has grown, which basically means the gap between the wealth, between the richest and the poorest is bigger than it's ever been. Goal number two, zero hunger, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. We'll talk about agriculture later in the semester. Goal three, good health and well-being. We want to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. So that's important. We don't want to just say healthy adults. We don't want to just say healthy children. We want good health and well-being for everybody. When we think about what goes into good health and well-being, part of that is having a healthy environment. Quality education, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. I know right now you're going, we're talking about the environment. Why are we talking about education? The more education that you have in a society, the more health and well-being you have, the better you can act sustainably and kind of take care of an environment. Gender equality is also a big, very important, and that TED Talk will talk about gender equality either. In addition, achieving gender equality and empower all women and girls. Some people might say, well, there is an obvious income gap between men and women in the United States. There's lots of parts of the world where women are not and girls are not even going to school. So we're talking, again, globally sustainable development goals. Clean water and sanitation, ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. We're going to talk a lot about water later in the semester. Clean water for most of us is a given. We turn on the tap, we get clean water. We can go to the store, we can buy clean water. But in lots of parts of the world, that is not true. And in lots of parts of the world, some of the poorest people, it is most expensive for them to get clean water. Affordable and clean energy, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. So switching away from these older fossil fuels that are going to eventually run out and are causing more pollution. Decent work and economic growth, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Right? We want to make sure that people have work, but we also want to make sure we went through a very dirty industrialization process that caused a lot of pollution, as did most of Europe and some other parts of the world. And so as we raise people out of poverty, we don't want to follow that exact same path. Industry, innovation, and infrastructure, reduce inequality within and among countries. So I talked about inequality a second ago, but that idea that gap between the wealthiest and the poorest is growing. You could take about the top 400 wealthiest people in the world, redistribute their wealth, and raise everybody out of poverty, above the poverty line. I'm not saying that's what we should do. I'm just saying that is the type of wealth inequality that we have. Number 10, reduce inequalities, not just wealth inequalities, but all inequalities, things like access to education and healthcare. We want to have sustainable cities and communities, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient. Resiliency is something we'll talk about later. Resiliency has to do with things like how fast can you bounce back from disease or natural disaster or some type of event? How resilient are you? Number 12, responsible consumption and production. Ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Right now, we have horribly unsustainable consumption and production. We use resources. We are producing way too much waste. We have, things like kind of fast fashion and disposable clothes, lots of things that we talked about in Geography 170 if you were in there. 13, climate action. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And again, we'll talk about this a lot later, but it's certainly pretty controversial in the US these days. Life below water. Conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. We'll talk about water, we'll talk about oceans later on, but many of the species that we fish on this planet are overexploited and in danger of collapse. Life on land, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification. So that's when you have flora that's removed or plants that are removed, and then you have basically a spread of the desert. And halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. We'll talk later about why biodiversity is so important. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. Provide access to justice for all and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So if you were to take my world regional geography class, which I actually don't teach at SDSU, but if you were to take it at another school I teach it at, you would know that open governments, have more citizen participation and have, kind of better records of protecting people, protecting the environment, and then partnership for goals, strengthen the means of implementation, and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. So here is community, right? We need community, and we need global community. And that is kind of the only way that we are going to get this done, is through cooperation and partnership. So now, I'm sorry, I have one more slide. There are some challenges to sustainable development. There are lots of challenges to sustainable development, but I'm going to talk about 5 main ones that your textbook talks about. So success of sustainable development kind of depends upon 5 areas. Improved ability to monitor and forecast long-term trends. So your kind of knowledge is only as good as the data that you're able to monitor and collect, and then kind of what you can do with that. And so that section in your text that talks a lot about science is really important there, right? We really want to use the best science available in order to accomplish these goals. We need to have ecosystem and social system connections, right? We are constantly linked with ecosystems. They're actually called linked social and ecological systems, or coupled human and natural systems. We are constantly affecting the environment. The environment is constantly connecting us, and we have to really work within those connections. We have to understand thresholds of change. So there are tipping points, right? If we go back to that example of fisheries, if you have a moment where, right, if you fish too much, that entire system is going to collapse, and we need to understand what those thresholds are. We also have to have incentives for sustainable behavior. We have to have ways to avoid that tragedy of the commons that I talked about at the beginning of this lecture. So sometimes that happens through financial incentives, sometimes it happens through policy, sometimes it happens through community pressure. And then we want to be able to integrate learning and action. We want to be able to be adaptive and understand and be able to change our actions accordingly. And these are all kind of very difficult things to do. So right now you're going to move on. You're going to watch a TED Talk. You are going to complete your writing exercise for this module, and then you are going to move on to your first quiz, which is not that long. You have 20 minutes to take it. It's about 10 questions. So you get a couple of minutes per question, which should be plenty of time to do it. Some of them are multiple choice, some of them are short answers, some of them are fill in the blank. The quizzes will, generally speaking, focus on either what I have lectured on or something that I have had you watch or read in addition to your text. So good